Angel's breath. She struck with lethal precision. Blood splattered across the room. The nobleman gasped and said, "Please spare me. I will give you anything. Just let me live." Kyla Angel stood over him, shrouded in her dark hood. She said, "Well, I already received a down payment worth far more than your life, so I cannot do that." It was an elite assassin guild, made up of human weapons. The guildmaster was both an angel and a grim reaper, feared across the continent. Her name was Kyla Angel. She stood before her followers, cloaked in shadows and steel. "I had no idea that I would die in vain. Like this, I believed a grim reaper could never be killed. This is Ian Angel, my one and only lover. But I guess I was wrong." Kyla Angel coughed up blood as she lay on the grass. Ian Angel looked down at her and said, "If you have any last words, go ahead and say them. I will hear you out. We were family." Kyla looked up at him with trembling eyes and asked, "Why are you doing this?" Ian Angel looked down at the wounded woman. "Why don't you take some time to figure that out for yourself? In the afterlife?" He lifted her chin with his fingers, mocking her final moments. "I have imagined how I might die as an assassin, but I did not think I would die like this." Ian Angel shoved Kyla Angel backward, sending her falling into the sunset. Kyla Angel collapsed onto the cold ground, blood pooling beneath her broken body. Ian Angel turned away and said, "Burn her body. Make sure you leave no remains, not even her ashes. I was betrayed by the guild, the very one I served my whole life, and killed by the person I trusted most." Kyla sank into the dark water as her vision began to fade. "Maybe this is my punishment. I was born in the slums, never knowing who my parents were." A young girl reached out to take a small bag of coins, surviving one day at a time. "Every day, I clawed my way through life and struggled to survive." Kyla Angel stole a purse from a noblewoman in the street. She pinned a man down, fighting for every scrap, only to have this happen to me. She looked down at the blood soaking through her clothes. Then again, it is a fitting sentence for someone who has taken so many lives. She stood amidst a sea of fallen enemies, red hair glowing in the dark. Kyla Angel looked up and said, "Oh." Ian Angel stood before her, surrounded by hooded figures, as the world dissolved in flames. "I am sorry, Emma. I wanted to see you again someday, but I am sure I will end up in hell." "Chell," Emilia called out. "Rachel, Leah is hungry." Emilia jumped on the bed and shouted, "Wake up, Rachel, hurry." Rachel Brown sat up, startled by the sudden weight. "Where am I?" Emilia cheered. "You are up. Wait, I just died, but my body feels so light, and I don't feel any pain at all." Rachel touched her chest to confirm she was alive. Emilia tilted her head and asked, "Rachel?" Rachel Brown looked at the girl. "Who is this kid?" She reached out and said, "You shouldn't climb on top of someone like that, little girl." Rachel tried to lift Emilia, but her arms strained. "Why is she so heavy?" She stared at the child in disbelief. "Why am I struggling to lift this small child?" Rachel stared at her reflection and asked, Wait, am I the woman in that mirror?" "No, it cannot be. I died because Ian Angel betrayed me." Rachel slapped her own face. Emilia rushed over and asked, "Rachel, what are you doing? Don't hit yourself, or you will get a boo-boo." Rachel let out a long breath and said, So I am not dreaming. What the hell is going on here?" Emilia looked up and asked, "Rachel, are you sick?" Emilia looked up and said, "You are acting weird today, and you didn't even hug me." "Calm down, Kyla Angel. Act normal and gather information, without raising suspicion." She forced a smile and said, "I just had a strange dream, that is all." "Hey kid, what was your name again?" Emilia puffed her cheeks. "I am not a kid, I am Emilia." Kyla Angel replied, "I see. You are gonna play with me, now right Rachel?" She looked at the toy box. "Sure, what do you want to do? Is my name Rachel?" Emilia lifted a red leash. "Tada, let's play walk the dog." Emilia pulled at her dress and said, "You pull the leash, Rachel. I will be the doggy." Rachel covered her face and replied, "Absolutely not. Where on earth did you get an idea like that?" Emilia pouted. "But why not? No one ever plays walk the dog with me." "Of course not, or they would get arrested." Rachel looked at the girl and said, "How about we do something else? Something way more fun." Emilia looked up. "Really? What are we going to do, Rachel?" She looked around the room. "Now that I am looking around, the walls are covered in luxurious silk wallpaper. This must be a count estate, at the very least. The child's clothes do not match her surroundings." Rachel Brown adjusted her skirt. She looked at the girl and said, "Rachel, the original owner of this body must have been the child's maid, but she does not seem well cared for. She looks a bit scruffy. Earlier I spoke to her casually, without thinking. I should address her formally from now on." Rachel smiled and said, "You said you were hungry earlier, miss. Why don't you have some breakfast first?" Rachel replied, "Okay." A loud banging echoed against the door. A voice shouted from outside, "Rachel Brown, I know you are in there." Rachel Brown looked down at her hands. "Is that the name of this body's original owner? Not Rachel?" Emilia pointed at the door and cried out, It is the old hag. The old hag. Let us see who this kid is calling an old hag. Rachel placed a hand on the girl's head and said, "Just a moment." She opened the door. Judging by her looking at her clothes, she must be the headmaid. The headmaid crossed her arms and asked, "What took you so long to open the door?" Countess Conrad wrote a letter of recommendation for you, so I expected you to do a proper job. How can you look after the prince and princess when you are so lazy? Rachel Brown bowed her head and said, "I am sorry." She froze in surprise. Did she just say, "Prince and princess"? The headmaid replied, "Yes. Honestly, where is your head?" "Thank goodness. Princess Amelia is here with you." Rachel Brown stood frozen. "Wait, did I wake up as a palace nanny in the Ventrum Empire?" An official shouted, "Prince Edwin disappeared while you were gone. Go find his highness at once. Don't just stand there in a daze." She looked back at her past self. Kyla Angel, the cold-blooded killer. Me, an assassin. Amelia laughed brightly, unaware of the chaos. Amelia cheered and said, "Let's go find my brother." The Ventrum Empire has ruled the eastern continent for 300 years. I cannot believe I came back from the dead and woke up in Ventrum's imperial palace. The headmaid asked, "Rachel, are you listening to me?" She looked down and replied, "Sorry, I just have a bit of a headache." "If you heard me, then get moving," the woman said as she opened the door. "Quit wasting my time with trivial matters." Amelia tugged on her dress and said, "Let's go, Rachel. Leah knows where Ed likes to go, to play by himself." She looked at the girl and replied, "Yes, your highness." "Right, I need to focus. This woman's name is Rachel Brown. Judging by her clothes, she seems to be a nanny. Rachel Brown is probably a lady from an insignificant noble family. Her surname is the kind a commoner would have." Amelia pulled her hand and asked, "Where can we find Prince Edwin?" She laughed and said, "Don't worry, just follow Leah." Should I really be babysitting this girl right now? I should be out there, hunting Ian down for revenge. The life of an assassin doesn't suit you, Kyla, the man said as he held her in the garden. "I thought what we had was real." Kyla looked up and asked, "Really? The other assassins think I am a cold-blooded wench." The man smiled and replied, "Well, those fools don't know how kind you are, my sweet Kyla." But everything was a lie. Amelia looked up and said, "Ian, huh?" Rachel turned her head. Did she just call my name? She knelt down and asked, "Why are you crying? Are you hurt?" Amelia burst into loud tears. "How do you calm down? A crying child again? What do I do?" Rachel remembered a boy from her past life. She had held him amidst the smoke and fire. She reached out and patted the girl's head. Rachel looked down and said, "Don't cry, your highness." Amelia looked up and asked, "Will you also stop crying then, Rachel?" She replied, "Yes, I won't cry either." Amelia cheered. "Okay, then Leah will stop crying. Slipping out of this palace will be easy, but there's no telling when I'll find Ian, and this body wasn't trained for combat either, so I should think this through first." Rachel lifted the girl and held her close. "For now I'll pretend to be this nanny." Amelia giggled and said, "You're so tall, Rachel. Just you wait, Ian." Rachel Brown held the young princess. "Regardless of why you betrayed me, I will never forgive you." She looked at the desolate grounds. "Why is the prince's palace so shabby?" The prince in question is Edwin Anaxinian Ventrum. He was the only son, born to Emperor Cableus III, and his third consort, Edis Lionel. His mother was practically sold off by her country as a political hostage. She died 3 years ago, after giving birth to Amelia. The prince and princess had no supporters in the empire, and were treated as if they were invisible at the palace. No wonder my memory of them was hazy. Servants who serve powerless masters always have it the hardest. Once I have gathered enough information on Ian, I will make my escape. Rachel stopped in her tracks. She looked at a small opening in the wall. Did he sneak out of his palace by himself? "Give it back," I said. "Give it back." "Wah, give it back." That is Ed's voice. Rachel set the princess down and said, "I will be right back. Please wait here, your highness." She leaped over the high stone wall and landed gracefully on the other side. Amelia watched with wide eyes and said, "Whoa, you are so cool, Rachel." Edwin shouted, "Give it back now." The older boy smirked and replied, "Why don't you come get it yourself, your highness?" Edwin glared at him. "You little." That is definitely Edwin, the third prince. The other boys are taller, but they are still kids. Are they his attendants? The boy in the yellow vest shoved the prince back. "Seriously, quit whining." Rachel Brown watched from the trees. "It is too early to step in. I will wait until he cries for help before I act." Edwin clenched his fist. "It is mine. Give it back." He lunged forward, but the older boy blocked him. Rachel said, "Oh dear. He is more tenacious than I thought." The red-haired boy laughed. "Your highness, a deal is a deal. As a prince you should know better." Edwin snapped back. "But I never made a deal with you." The boy held the item high. "We won this fair and square. In a bet. How could you try to steal it? Back like a rat?" Edwin Anaxinian Ventrum shouted. "You tricked me. It was a scam." The young man replied, "A scam? That is a dangerous accusation. He grabbed Edwin by the collar. If you want it back so badly, why don't we make another bet? The man grinned and asked, what will you wager this time? Your hand perhaps? There is not much else to offer. Rachel Brown suddenly appeared. She grabbed the man's arm and slammed him into the ground. The man screamed in pain. Ack! Rachel pinned him down, then looked up and asked, what are you doing out here? Your Highness. Edwin stared at her, trembling in shock. Rachel Brown? She looked at the men and said, I believe you have something that belongs to His Highness. Release it. She stood her ground and said, give it back, while I am asking nicely. The men began to stir. One of them asked, wait, are we in trouble? Another whispered, if word gets out that we messed with the prince, we are all as good as dead. The man in brown smirked. Don't panic, all the maids at the third prince's palace are from unimportant families. He looked at her and said, Miss, we made a bet with His Highness and won the item, fair and square, but now he is trying to take it back by force. Rachel Brown looked at the boy and said, that is no different from theft, is it? Edwin Anaxinian Ventrum stood frozen as she stepped closer and said, very well, then I will make a bet with you. Rachel Brown smiled and continued, if you won the item in a wager, you would not mind losing it the same way, right? Rachel Brown extended her hand and said, if you won the item in a wager, you won't mind losing it the same way, right? The young man asked, but what will you be wagering, miss? You don't seem to have an item as valuable as His Highness's. Rachel Brown raised her hand and said, I'll bet my hand, even if I were to win the bracelet, it'd be useless without a hand to wear it on. That'd be a fair price, wouldn't you say? The blonde boy asked, are you serious? I'm the youngest son of a count, and the second prince's attendant. How dare she challenge me, instead of bowing her head before me? So this petty servant also has a noble's pride. The young man reached out and said, very well, I'll make you regret betting your hand. Emilia looked at the woman beside her. Is she really going to be okay? A gambler slammed a cup down. Let's settle this with a game of Monty. Perhaps you don't know the rules, since you're a noble lady. Monty, a simple street game, 3 cups and 1 ball. I used to play it all the time, with the other assassins. Rachel Brown looked at the man and said, I know the rules, so you needn't explain them to me. Emilia grabbed her arm and asked, what are you doing? Get up this instant. These guys use sneaky tricks. I was duped with my eyes wide open. Rachel looked at the jewelry on the table. Do you not want the bracelet back? Emilia stammered. Well, I do, but please trust me, Your Highness, she said while looking into her eyes. The dealer flipped a cup over a red ball and said, it is too bad, miss. Don't blame me when you lose your hand. He gestured to the table. You get 3 chances. If you guess correctly twice, the bracelet is yours. The dealer smirked and said, very well. He grabbed the cups and shuffled them across the wood with blinding speed. Rachel Brown watched the movement. Her green eyes tracked every slide. As Emilia stood beside her, the dealer stopped his hands and asked, which cup is hiding the ball? Rachel Brown stared at the table. She pointed and said, the one on the right. Rachel Brown smiled and said, if I guess correctly one more time, I win. The boy watched the table. Lucky guess. A red ball rolled across the wood. The crowd gasped. The gambler shuffled the cups. It is a little early to celebrate your victory, miss. He slammed a cup down. So where is the ball now? You are cheating. Rachel Brown glared at the men. You with the orange hair. Show me your left hand. The accomplice flinched and replied, what are you talking about? I was standing perfectly still. Right here. She stepped toward the table. As the men backed away, Rachel Brown grabbed the boy and yanked him forward. This is ridiculous. Ack. She held up a red ball and said, it is the rubber ball. This boy was crouching next to you earlier. While you were shuffling the cups, you deflected the ball toward him on purpose. Then he caught it. She pulled his arm back, snuck it behind his back, so I would not see it, and secretly handed it back to you. You were hiding extra balls all along, so you could slip one under a cup that I did not pick. A man in the crowd asked, wait, does this mean Gale tricked us too? No wonder he won all the games we played. The boy turned red and looked away. The man tossed the bracelet onto the table and said, fine, take it. You won the damn bet. Rachel Brown looked at him. Did you use the same tricks on His Highness? That is typical street thug behavior. Be grateful I am letting you off, because you are a wench. Now get lost. Don't push your luck. Letting me off? Think again. She grabbed his collar. Committing fraud against the imperial family is high treason and punishable by execution. You fool. Don't use such petty tricks to do things you cannot take responsibility for. The man scoffed and replied, so what if he is a prince? He is a powerless one. Everyone knows he is treated worse than a servant. Rachel tightened her grip. Even so, a royal is still a royal. Who do you think matters more to the palace? The empire's prince, or some noble's brat son? A guard grabbed Gale by the arm and said, let's go. Gale struggled against the grip and shouted at Rachel Brown, just wait. You will regret this. I will remember your face. Rachel watched him go and asked, "Who are you to threaten me, you little punk?" The nervous boy stepped forward and replied, "I am sorry, I was only doing what Gale told me to do." Rachel looked at him and said, "You should be apologizing to His Highness, not me." The boy bowed deeply to the young prince. "I am truly sorry, Your Highness." The prince clenched his shirt. "I swear, I will never let anyone disrespect you again." The young prince looked ahead and said, "I will let it slide this once, but if it happens again, I won't be as forgiving. Got it?" A voice from the distance replied, "Yes, Your Highness." A dark-haired man watched from the shadows. He adjusted his collar and said, "Well, well, that was quite the show. The hand tricks those kids used were for seasoned swindlers." Yet Rachel Brown saw through them instantly. Not only that, she jumped over a wall that even a grown man would struggle to clear. "That woman reminds me of Kyla Angel." The subordinate rushed over and said, "My lord, what are you doing here? You disappeared suddenly, so I was worried." The man looked back and asked, "Am I really someone you need to worry about?" The subordinate replied, "Well, we are in enemy territory right now. Please avoid drawing attention to yourself." The man smiled and said, All right, all right." The blonde knight asked, "My lord, are you still searching for Kyla Angel?" The dark-haired man glared. "I told you not to speak that name aloud." The knight bowed and replied, "Forgive me, His Majesty is waiting. We should go now." Rachel Brown walked with the boy. "I thought I felt someone watching me. Was it just my imagination?" The boy looked back. "I am sure he wants to thank me for saving the day." Rachel Brown watched him. "What the hell was that about?" The prince glared and asked, "Who told you to butt in?" "I got the bracelet back for him. Why is he getting mad? Instead of thanking me? For now I will just apologize and humor this kid." Rachel Brown bowed and said, "I am sorry." The prince pointed at her. "Liar, you are not sorry at all. Emma Conrad said you were sick. Were you just faking it?" Rachel smiled and replied, "It was just a light headache. I am feeling better now. Thank you for your concern, Your Highness." The prince looked at her. "Is something wrong? Something about you is different." Rachel froze. Did he figure it out? Rachel asked, "What do you mean, Your Highness?" The prince looked up. "You are uglier than usual." Rachel asked, "Did I do something to offend you, Your Highness?" "Emma may have recommended you, but I do not trust you." He said, "You are on the old hag side anyway." The headmaid said, "I was hired as a nanny, thanks to Countess Conrad." Recommendation letter. Is the Countess' full name Emma Conrad? She is not the same Emma. I know, right? What kind of nanny was Rachel Brown anyway? How did she make this many enemies in the past 2 weeks? The prince looked at her. "Anyway, how did you know those guys were cheating earlier?" Rachel Brown said, "I have seen people use that trick on the street. That attendant was slower compared to those people, but do not feel bad about falling for it, Your Highness." The prince shouted, "I did not fall for his trick. Quit showing off when you are uglier than me." Rachel clenched her fist. "Should I smack him?" She looked at him and said, "You know, Your Highness, the way you see others says more about you than it does about them." The prince asked, "What, are you insulting me when I am a prince?" Rachel replied, "I am just giving advice because I want you to become a good person. After all, I am your nanny." The prince snatched the bracelet and yelled, "I hate people like you the most." The prince pointed a finger and shouted at Rachel Brown, "Don't talk to me again. Got it?" He dashed away into the garden. "It is strange. Why did she help me? She always looked the other way when I was being bullied. It has been a while since anyone other than Emma has cared about me." Rachel Brown watched him leave. The prince went back to his palace. "Now I just need to take Amelia back." She looked at the empty spot where the princess had been. "What the? I told her to wait right here. Where did she go?" Rachel Brown looked around in panic, searching for any sign of Amelia. Rachel Brown turned and asked, "What are you doing here, Your Highness?" Emma Conrad looked down at the young princess. "Why did you steal the food meant for the second prince?" Amelia looked away and replied, "Liao was hungry." Emma frowned and said, "A princess like you should really know better." She turned to Rachel. "I thought I told you to look after Her Highness." Rachel lowered her head and replied, "I am sorry." Emma crossed her arms. "If I catch you slacking, your pay will be docked. Understood? Damn it, I cannot believe this petty civilian is threatening my pay." Rachel bowed and said, "Yes, ma'am, it won't happen again. This hurts my pride, but I have no choice. I need money if I want to escape this place." A passing maid snickered. "Can you believe that troublemaker is a princess? Honestly, it is impressive how she and her brother cause trouble every single day." The door shut, leaving the room in silence. Amelia looked up and said, "Rachel, I am sorry." Rachel wiped the girl's face. "It is all right. I should not have left you alone. Your Highness, I am truly sorry. I need to get used to this, the life of an ordinary nanny. Even now, the assassin in me is showing. I have never known what it means to live an ordinary life. Rachel muttered, "It is funny." Amelia looked up and asked, "Huh?" She pulled the child into a hug and said, "It is nothing, nothing at all." Rachel approached the bed and said, "Your Highness, it is time to wake up." Amelia hugged her teddy bear. "But I am still sleepy." Rachel. She sat up and asked, "What about Ed?" Rachel replied, "I was just about to go wake him." Amelia reached out her arms. "Wanna know where he is?" "Leah can tell you." "That won't be necessary," Rachel said, having tracked the two of them yesterday. "I know their usual routes. Yesterday I learned 3 important things while eavesdropping on people around the palace. Firstly, I came back to life a year after I died. Secondly, the real Rachel Brown was recommended as a nanny by the previous nanny, Countess Conrad. I tried to gather more information from the servants, but the moment I mentioned the name of the countess, they clammed up." A maid looked away and said, "Countess Conrad? I am not sure. Don't you know more about her, Ms. Rachel Brown?" "So far the only thing I have learned is that Rachel and the countess were quite close." Rachel Brown watched the guards patrolling the gardens below. "Lastly, security around the palace is tighter because a king and his delegation are visiting from abroad. I wanted to slip out to gather information on Ian, but I must lie low for now." She carried Amelia through the hall, holding a single child. "Is tiring me out this much? Getting revenge in this body is out of the question. I will wait for the right time." A maid passed by as Rachel entered the bedroom. Edwin Anaxinian Ventrum sat up on the large bed and asked, "What are you doing here at this hour?" Rachel held the child close. "Don't overthink it. This is just another job." Rachel held Amelia and said, "As your nanny, it is only natural for me to wake you. I am working as a nanny. My clients are a temperamental prince and a troublemaker princess." Edwin looked up and said, "Well, this is a surprise. You never came to wake me at this time once in the past 2 weeks." He sat up and continued, "In fact, you acted like you did not care about me at all. But yesterday you came running as if your life depended on it. What has gotten into you?" Rachel bowed and said, "I apologize. I was having trouble adjusting to my new environment. As a result, I acted disrespectfully toward your highness." Edwin turned away and said, "Whatever. I am going to wash my face. This kid has such an attitude." He splashed water on his face and said, "I am done." "That is it?" Rachel looked at him and said, "You should wash behind your ears too." Edwin turned back and shouted, "Hey, I washed everything." Rachel Brown said, "Your highness, the places you cannot see, collect the most dirt, like behind your ears or your neck." Edwin Anaxinian Ventrum replied, "I am a prince, so I am not dirty." "No, your highness, you are dirty. The top of your head smells like horse poop." Edwin gasped, "Horse poop? Guess I will have to wash him myself. But, is his water always ice cold?" Rachel looked at the maid. "His highness's water is too cold. Please bring some warm water." The maid smiled and replied, "Pardon? You must be mistaken. It was warm when I brought it here." Rachel Brown held Amelia close. "I dipped my fingers in just a moment ago, and it was cold." The maid waved her hand and said, "It must have cooled down since I brought it." "Didn't his highness say he was done washing? Do I really need to fetch a whole new basin of water?" She turned to Edwin and asked, "Isn't that right, your highness?" Edwin looked away without a word. Rachel watched the maid with a cold gaze. "These servants need some serious disciplining." She stepped forward. The maid looked up and asked, "Miss?" Rachel grabbed the basin and dumped the water over the woman. The maid screamed as the cold water soaked her clothes. Rachel looked down at her and asked, "So now that you have felt it for yourself, is this water warm or cold?" Rachel Brown looked at the servant and said, "Bring us a fresh basin of water, and this time make sure it is actually warm. You had better not make me repeat myself." The maid stammered, "Why, yes, ma'am." She grabbed the basin and hurried away. Why is she picking a fight that she cannot even win? Amelia cheered and reached out. "Rachel, I want to play with water too." Rachel Brown held the girl and replied, "I was not playing with it." She turned to the young prince. "Your highness." Edwin Anaxinian Ventrum flinched. "Ha, why yes." Rachel Brown looked at him and said, "If something like this happens again, please report it to the headmaid. Ignoring the issue won't fix anything." Edwin looked down at the floor. But what would be the point? The old hag always takes the maid's side anyway. It wasn't like this when Emma was around. There is that name again. Did she quit? Edwin clenched his fist and said, "No, she died because of me." Rachel watched him while holding Amelia. The young princess clung to her. A maid rushed in and said, "I brought the water." Rachel checked the basin and said, "Good, it is warm this time." She looked at the prince and said, "Your highness, if you will excuse me for a moment." Rachel lifted the basin, but water splashed onto her hand. Edwin struggled and said, "Let go of me. What are you?" Pfft. Amelia scrubbed his face. "You have to scrub your face properly. Like this." Rachel looked down at the prince. "Since you are already soaked, let me wash your hair for you. That is also part of my job." As your nanny, Edwin screamed. No. Rachel ignored his cries and continued the bath. Mission complete. Rachel Brown watched the children eat and said, compared to yesterday, Your Highness, today is off to a smooth start. The loser has to eat all the leftovers. Anyway, talk about a feast first thing in the morning. Back when I lived as a commoner, I never got to have food like this. Maybe this nanny gig isn't so bad after all. Edwin Anaxinian Ventrum put down his fork. I am done eating. He picked out all the vegetables. Rachel Brown looked at the plate and said, Food is precious, Your Highness. You should eat as much as you can, while it is in front of you. Edwin Anaxinian Ventrum frowned and replied, But vegetables taste bad. As long as they are not rotten, isn't that good enough? I do not really care whether he starves or eats to death, but as his nanny, I have a duty to fulfill. She looked at him and asked, Then why don't we make a bet? Edwin Anaxinian Ventrum asked, A bet? Rachel Brown smiled and said, Yes, the loser has to eat all the leftover vegetables. He turned away and replied, I am not playing Monty. You would just win again. Edwin Anaxinian Ventrum smiled and asked, Then how about a game of hide and seek? That is my specialty. Amelia raised her hand and said, Hide and seek? Liao wants to play too. Rachel Brown looked at the children. Do you also dislike vegetables? Your Highness. Amelia shook her head and replied, Nope. The princess is 1,000 times better than the prince. Rachel picked up the girl and said, Princess Amelia and I will be the seekers. Let us keep our game on the first floor, where the dining hall is. If I cannot find you in time, you win. Edwin stood by a large door. You said the loser has to eat all the vegetables. Right, I will make you regret this. Just you wait. Rachel called out from the hall. We will come looking for you in 10 minutes. Edwin ran through the corridor. This is not a good hiding place. I have to find a place she would never think to check. Edwin Anaxinian Ventrum looked around the room. There it is. She will never find me in here. He climbed into the wooden chest and pulled the lid shut. One maid said, I have never seen anyone that handsome in my life. The other maid asked, Is the king of Adamanti really that good looking? His hair is jet black, like the night sky. His skin is sun-kissed, and his amber eyes shine like stars. I thought he was a statue that walked out of the temple. If only I could be held in his arms just once. The other maid replied, Quit daydreaming and help me. Edwin huddled in the dark. As his heart raced, the maid said, The rats have been causing so much trouble lately. A maid said, This should do, right? Let's go. We have a lot of work to do. Edwin crouched in the shadows. Those maids almost found me first. By now the nanny must be looking in all the wrong places. Sitting here like this reminds me of the past. Lloyd crossed his arms and asked, Do you want to join our game of hide and seek? Edwin looked up and asked, Can I really join you, Lloyd? He replied, Of course. We need more people to play. Come here. Lloyd led him to a dark corner. If you hide here, no one will ever find you. You take cover. Lloyd led the way and said, Here, Edwin. Edwin looked up and asked, What about you, Lloyd? I have got another place in mind. If someone finds you here, shout and let me know. Got it? Lloyd placed his hands on the boy's shoulders. That way we will win. But you cannot come out until the seeker finds you, no matter what. If you do, we will lose, and it will be your fault. Edwin nodded and said, Okay, don't worry. You can count on me. He climbed into the crate, while Lloyd watched him with a sharp gaze. I will. Edwin sat in the dark, clutching his knees. As his heart raced, Edwin smiled to himself. It is the first time Lloyd asked me to play. I should do my best, so I do not disappoint him. Then he will play with me again. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room. Edwin huddled in the dark corner. Why is no one coming? He reached for the door. Should I take a look outside? Lloyd had warned him. You cannot come out until the seeker finds you, no matter what. If you do, we will lose, and it will be your fault. Edwin. He pulled his hand back. No, I will wait a little longer. They are probably just having trouble finding me. I am sure they did not forget about me. A muffled voice echoed from the distance. Ness. Emma Conrad rushed forward and asked, Your Highness, are you all right? Edwin Anaxinian Ventrum looked up. Emma? She knelt by the wooden crate. I was so worried that something might have happened to you. He climbed out and replied, Oh, I am all right. Emma looked around and asked, But where is Lloyd? The servants whispered in the halls. What a nuisance. No wonder the king does not favor him. So many people are running around at night looking for him because of his childish prank. Edwin stood frozen. Lloyd did not forget about me. He never intended to play with me. Emma leaned in and asked, Your Highness. He looked away and replied, It is nothing. In the first place, this isn't fun anymore. Edwin tapped the lid, but it did not move. He pushed harder against the heavy wood. What's going on? He asked. Why won't the lid open? Wait, I heard they put stones on top of boxes to keep rats out of the food. Is that what those maids did earlier? Does that mean I am trapped? Edwin pounded on the wood. Is there anyone out there? Why won't the stupid lid budge? He strained against the weight, before collapsing in the dark. Emma is no longer here. To look for me. The maids could not care less. They probably haven't even noticed that I am missing. I am sure that Nanny doesn't care either. The heavy lid swung open. Light flooded the small space. Rachel Brown looked down and said, "There you are, Your Highness." Amelia cheered from behind. "We found Ed." Edwin looked up, with tears in his eyes. Edwin wailed from behind the desk. "What took you so long, you idiot?" Rachel Brown held Amelia and looked at the crying children. "Why are you crying? Don't cry. This princess cries so easily. Last time she burst into tears when she saw me crying." She closed the desk lid. "Please stop crying now, Your Highnesses." Edwin sniffled and asked, "So does this mean I won the bet?" Rachel replied, "Does that matter right now? Adults stop crying if you threaten them a little, but kids are another story. That's why I was never good with children." "It does. The fate of the vegetables depends on it." Rachel reached out to wipe the tears from the face of the prince. "I'm terrible at comforting them." She looked at Edwin and said, "I'm sorry I was late, but I'll have to get used to it." Edwin sat at the dining table and asked, "What took you so long to find me anyway?" Rachel stood beside him and replied, "The head maid stopped me on the way." In the hallway, the head maid had asked, "What are you doing?" Rachel had simply replied, "Playing hide and seek." She looked at the prince. "Why did you come? Looking for me?" Edwin blushed and said, "Oh right." Rachel smiled and said, "The game cannot end until I find you, Your Highness. By the way, I won, so why haven't you finished your vegetables?" Edwin looked at his plate. "Because they are cold now. How am I supposed to eat them in this state? They will taste even worse." Rachel leaned in and said, "Well, those were the rules of the game, Your Highness. You promised to eat them, regardless of how they taste." Edwin trembled as he picked up a piece of food. Rachel watched the children eat. "Why does that bracelet look so familiar?" "The fact that the prince's previous nanny was named Emma bothers me too." She looked at the boy and asked, "Your Highness, may I ask you a question?" Edwin looked up and asked, "What is it?" Rachel pointed to his wrist. "Is that bracelet important to you? You keep it on you, like it is a precious item." Amelia raised her hand and said, "That bracelet was Emma's. Emma gave it to him. There it is again. That name." Edwin turned to the girl. "Leah, you don't have to tell her these things." He lowered his head. "You're right. This bracelet is very important to me. It's a reminder of Emma's last wish." Rachel asked, "Last wish?" Rachel Brown looked away. She said, "She wanted me to be happy. That brings back a memory." Emma Conrad looked at the gift. "Goodness, Kyla, what is this?" Kyla Angel held out a bracelet. "A token of my gratitude. If you bring it to me, I will grant you 3 wishes, without requesting any payment." Emma smiled and said, "I see you are still as curt as ever. You could have just said it was a gift." She looked at the jewelry. "Let us see. What shall I wish for with this precious gift?" Emma looked at Kyla and said, "Right, I will start with my first wish. Please keep visiting me from now on." Emma Conrad smiled and said, "For my second wish, come to me anytime. If you are struggling with your work, even if we are not related by blood, we are still family. As for my last wish, I will save it for later. Who knows, you might disappear again, without a word." The Emma I knew wanted everyone to be happy, and accepted them into her warm embrace. Could this Emma, the prince's former nanny, be the same Emma I once knew? Edwin sat at the table and looked at me. He said, "Here I have a gift for you." Rachel replied, "Thank you." "Why is the gift tickling my hand?" A green insect crawled across my palm. Edwin laughed and said, "Ha ha ha, gotcha." Rachel lifted the insect. "I am not a huge fan of insects, so you can have this one back, Your Highness." She dropped the bug onto his head. Edwin shouted, "Ack, what do you think you are doing?" Amelia laughed and said, "Haha, she got you back, Ed." Edwin walked down the hall. "I am going straight to bed. When I am back in my room." Rachel followed him while carrying the princess and said, "But you must wash yourself first, Your Highness." Edwin sniffed his sleeve. "Do I smell like horse poop again?" Rachel replied, "No, this time your entire body smells like dirt." Emma Conrad blocked the path. "Your Highness." Edwin flinched and replied, what? "No." She looked at the boy. "Did you happen to leave your palace yesterday?" Emma Conrad walked toward the prince and said, "One of your maids said she saw you near the stables yesterday." She suddenly grabbed Edwin by the arm and asked, "Did you really not go outside?" The woman in black asked, "Did you really not go outside?" Rachel Brown held Amelia close. "I was wondering, who ratted on him?" "It is the maid who brought the basin of cold water." "Did she snitch on the prince because I humiliated her?" The prince stammered, "All I did was step out for a bit and take a walk." "A walk?" the woman asked. "I thought I told you not to wander around without my permission." The prince looked down. "But..." Rachel Brown stepped forward and said, "I went out with him, ma'am." The woman turned and asked, "What was that, Lady Rachel?" Rachel replied, His Highness felt cooped up inside the palace, so we went for a short stroll together. The woman in black pushed the prince away and said, "That is absurd." Rachel Brown held Amelia and asked, "What gives you the right to take His Highness outside without permission?" She smiled and replied, "Isn't that something a nanny is allowed to do?" The woman in black glared at her and said, "It hasn't even been a month since you started working here. You are still being vetted. We cannot entrust the prince to someone like you." Rachel Brown narrowed her eyes and said, "That is odd. It seems the maids here should be vetted instead." The woman in black asked, "Excuse me?" Rachel Brown looked at the maid behind them and said, "I am sure you did not instruct that maid to take cold water to His Highness." The woman in black stiffened and replied, "Very well, as His Highness's nanny, you can be in charge of his well-being from now on." She turned around and walked away with the other maid. Footsteps echoed through the hall before the heavy doors slammed open. The young prince shouted, "What do you think you are doing?" Rachel Brown held Amelia close and replied calmly, "Everything will be fine, Your Highness." She reached out to pat the boy on the head. "At least they won't bring you cold water from now on." Rachel stood before the servants. "Don't be ridiculous. Why aren't you doing your jobs?" The maids looked away. "What do you mean? You can't prepare His Highness's meal?" They snickered and replied, "We are sorry." The head maid said, "You would handle every task related to His Highness from now on." The older maid smiled and said, "We are just following her instructions. That is all." Rachel Brown looked at them. "So you are telling me to prepare his meals myself?" The maids gasped. "We have work to do, so please excuse us." They turned and ran away. So this is how they are going to play it. That woman must have planned this from the beginning. She acted like she was giving me authority, only to dump all the work on me. The other maids are clearly on her side. To them I am just an outsider stirring the pot. Rachel walked down the hallway. A passing maid whispered, "Hey, quit staring at her. So she is the nanny, huh? I have not been in this body very long, but one thing is clear. It is not just the prince and princess who are alone. No one here is on Rachel Brown's side either. Even so, I cannot let the prince wash himself with cold water, or let a child go hungry. As for cooking, a warm bowl of poison soup is all I have ever made to eliminate my targets before. I should at least bring him the black bread the servants eat." I can already hear that powerless prince complaining. A maid shouted at another, "Are you deaf or just stupid? I told you to wash all the curtains this morning. Why should I do all your chores for you? I am not your personal maid." The maid screamed, "How dare you speak to me so casually?" She raised her hand and slapped the other girl hard across the face. The maid pointed a finger and shouted, "You are just masquerading as a noble. You have some nerve talking back to the daughter of a count." She grabbed the blonde girl by her hair. "Countess Conrad has done nothing but disrupt the order at the palace. That must be why the maids at the annex are getting so arrogant. On top of that, she brought in some obscure wench as the prince's nanny." Rachel Brown approached and asked, "Are you talking about me?" The maid froze and stammered, Lady Rachel?" Rachel looked at her and said, "I didn't realize this was how the maids sorted out their hierarchy here. I don't know the full story, but you should refrain from using violence." The maid glared and asked, "Are you saying we are at fault?" The maid glared and asked, "What gives you the right to make that call?" Rachel Brown stood her ground and replied, "I am not trying to pass judgment on who is right or wrong. However, I do have the right to hold you accountable for badmouthing me behind my back." The other maids froze in fear. Rachel looked at them and asked, "Why are you making that face? Are you upset that an obscure wench like me is calling you out?" The maid rushed forward and shouted, "You would not dare look me in the eye outside the palace. So how dare you lecture me? You are just a lowly orphan, adopted by the count, so know your place." She raised her hand to strike, but Rachel caught her wrist and held it firmly. Rachel looked into her eyes and said, "Well, you do not know what my life was like before my adoption. For all you know." Rachel Brown grabbed the maid by the wrist. "I could have killed people before." Rachel Brown leaned in, gripping the maid's collar, and said, "For all you know, I could have killed people before." She released the woman with a sharp shove. "If I catch you gossiping again, it won't end well. Is that clear?" I merely warned those maids not to run their mouths. The terrified maid scrambled away, shouting, "Yes." Catherine Vale stood up, brushing off her uniform. She looked at Rachel and asked, "What are you still doing on the ground?" She grabbed Rachel's hand with a bright smile and said, "You're the new nanny, right? Thank you for helping me. You really saved me." Back there, the maids huddled together, whispering, "That nanny is way too strong." "Yes, I saw." Rachel Brown turned to leave and said, "Well then, please excuse me." Catherine Vale rushed forward and said, "Wait, let me introduce myself first. My name is Catherine Vale. I work in the annex of the Third Prince's Palace. If there is anything I can help you with, Please let me know. Anything at all. I would like to return the favor. Rachel stopped and asked. Return the favor? Catherine looked at her and asked. Yes. Rachel rummaged through her things and asked. In that case, do you know how to cook? Amelia took a bite of food and said. This is delicious. What is it? I have only had food this good at banquets before. Amelia cheered while eating. Yes, it is so yummy. Rachel Brown looked at the table. It is just a simple fish stew. Your Highness, you are too kind. Catherine Vale smiled and said. Making a simple dish taste good is a talent. Thank you, Lady Rachel. She leaned closer and asked. But will you be all right? Rachel asked. Pardon? I heard the headmaid told the others not to help me with anything. Catherine laughed and replied. Oh, but I did not help you, Lady Rachel. Rachel looked confused. What? Catherine watched the children eat. I simply prepared a meal, because the master of this palace should not go hungry. Thank you for worrying about me, but no one will find out about this. The maids at the main palace eat separately. They do not care what happens in the annex. Rachel asked. Wait, the maids eat separately? Catherine nodded. Yes, most maids at the main palace are from noble families with long lineages. On the other hand, maids at the annex are commoners, or come from families who purchased titles with money, Catherine Vale said. As a result, there is a lot of tension between the two groups, so that is why that maid made such a fuss earlier about being a count daughter. Catherine fidgeted with her hands and said, no one will care where the leftover food ends up. The headmaid won't notice either, so you don't have to worry about me. Rachel Brown replied. I see, that is a relief. He seems to have misunderstood what I said to the headmaid. Now he thinks he can go out whenever he wants, as long as I am with him. Emperor Kablius III looked up and said, I want to go outside. Rachel smiled and said, there is plenty of fun to be had within the palace, Your Highness. Amelia jumped up and said, Leah also wants to go outside. Not the princess too? Catherine said, I will clear the dishes, so please go ahead. Catherine Vale took the plates and said, no, let me do that. These are from the annex anyway. You can just go with them, Lady Rachel. Amelia grabbed Rachel Brown by the hand. Let's go, Rachel. Rachel followed the young princess and replied, yes, Your Highness. The first prince pointed toward the buildings. That over there is the Imperial Library, Leah, and the palace next to it is where the first prince lives. Amelia looked up at him and said, Leah already knows that. The prince smiled and asked, then can you find your way back on your own? Of course. Leah's smart, so she won't get lost. The prince laughed and asked, and where did you get your brains from? Amelia hugged his arm and replied, you of course. Rachel watched them from a distance. They're two peas in a pod. The prince is an angel to his sister. He shouted, I said I don't want spinach. If only he could be as angelic to other people. Amelia looked up and asked, huh? She pointed toward the path. It is father. If that is her father, he must be Emperor Kablius III. He looks exactly as I remember from my assassin days. Who is that standing beside him in full uniform? Is he a delegate visiting from abroad? Could he be a knight? No, he looks like someone of high rank, perhaps a new noble. Emperor Kablius III smiled. Did he feel my eyes on him? How did he notice me from so far away? If his senses are so keen, I should try not to attract his attention. Amelia dropped her yellow ball, and it rolled across the stone. Damn it! A boot stopped the ball. As it rolled away, Emperor Kablius III picked it up and said, pardon me for a moment, Your Majesty. He approached Rachel Brown and held out the toy. Here, I will just grab the ball and get out of here. Rachel Brown took the ball and said, thank you. Emperor Kablius III looked at Rachel Brown and said, by the way, have we met somewhere before? The man asked, have we met somewhere before? Rachel Brown was adopted by a count. There is no way she would know a man like this. She replied, no, I can tell at a glance. He ranks higher than a count. Why did he leave the emperor to come all the way here? Rachel looked at him and said, you must be mistaken. The man smiled. Then again, there is no way I would find the person I am searching for so easily. He stepped closer. Still, you seem so familiar. Are you sure this is our first time meeting? If he can see past the outer shell of Rachel Brown, could he be someone I knew from my past life? But I do not remember seeing a man like this before. There is no way he would recognize me now that I am in someone else's body. Rachel replied, yes, I believe so. The man bowed and said, then it seems I was mistaken. Please excuse me. The young prince looked at Amelia. I am glad you recovered your ball, Your Highness. She hugged the yellow ball. Me too. The man walked away and said, until next time, miss. Amelia looked up and said, I did not even get to say thank you. If he really had a connection to Rachel Brown, we will cross paths again. But right now, these two are my priority. Rachel Brown looked at them. Shall we head back as well? The young prince asked. Already? What is this? Something feels off. Rachel Brown called out. You there? The maid stopped and asked. Yes, Rachel held Amelia and asked, did something happen while I was gone? The maid smiled and replied, oh well, you see, one of the maids at the annex had the nerve to disobey the head maid. That commoner dared to serve His Highness a meal without permission, the kitchen staff claimed. They knew nothing about it. Rachel asked, what happened to her? The maid replied, what do you think? The head maid punished her personally. She must be locked up in the food storage now. The maid turned away and said, well, I have a lot of work to do. Please excuse me. The boy looked up and asked, what is she talking about? That maid was punished for bringing me food? Rachel Brown looked at the prince and said, Your Highness, please return to your room with Princess Amelia. The prince held the young girl and asked, what? Where are you going? Rachel turned to leave and replied, I must make a brief stop somewhere. Wait, what are you planning to do? The prince called out as she walked away. Rachel reached a wooden door and knocked. Catherine, are you in there? Catherine Vale whispered from the other side. Lady Rachel? Rachel asked, what happened? Catherine sighed and replied, well, the head maid found out that I served His Highness a meal, but she was lenient with me. She continued through the door. She said she would let me out once I reflected on my actions. For a day, this maid got punished because of me, so I have to take responsibility. Rachel approached the door and said, just a moment. Catherine replied, pardon? The door swung open. Catherine looked up and asked, how did you do that? The head maid has the key. Rachel dropped a hairpin and said, you do not always need a key to open a lock. Catherine looked worried and said, but you will also be punished if you get caught. Rachel stepped closer and said, stay still. She grabbed Catherine and said, wait, Ack. Rachel Brown asked, I just have one question. You knew you would be punished, so why did you help me? Catherine Vale laughed and replied, like I said, I was not helping you. I am being serious. Rachel said. Catherine fidgeted with her hands. It was because I was grateful. The maids from the main palace have harassed me for so long, and you are the only person who ever stood up for me, so I wanted to help you in any way I could. Rachel looked at her. Catherine. Yes, she asked. Rachel took her hands and said, I helped you because it was the right thing to do. Rachel said, that maid's actions were objectively unreasonable, and that kind of behavior is one of the things I despise the most. She pulled Catherine along and continued, you getting punished was all my fault, so it is only right that I get you out. Therefore, you do not have to feel indebted to me. Catherine laughed and said, you are an unusual person, Lady Rachel, an unusual yet good person. I cannot believe she is calling an assassin a good person. If I am a good person, all the good people in the world must be dead. Catherine smiled and said, goodness, Lady Rachel, you are just saying that because you are embarrassed, aren't you? Two maids rushed forward and shouted, Catherine. They looked at her in shock and asked, my goodness, what happened to you? Just look at your back. The maids crowded around and asked, are you okay? Did the head maid let you out? Catherine Vale shook her head and said, no, the nanny did. The head maid has gone too far this time. She never says anything when the maids at the main palace cause trouble. Exactly, whenever they slack off, it is somehow our fault. Another maid added, if it were not for Countess Katrina, that woman would have been kicked out ages ago. The maids flinched as they noticed a presence behind them. Hush. Rachel Brown stepped forward and asked, could you tell me more about the head maid?